You bump into a chair and apologize to the chair. Someone walks into you and you are the one who says sorry. You ask a question at work and preface it with an apology for asking. You send a text that says sorry for the late reply, when the reply came 4 hours later on a topic that was never urgent. And somewhere, quietly, you have started to wonder, why do I do this? Why does the word sorry come out of me before I have even decided whether an apology is warranted? This is not politeness. Politeness has a purpose and a limit. What you are describing is something else, a reflex that fires regardless of whether you have actually done anything wrong. And the psychology behind that reflex reaches back further than most people expect, into some of the earliest and most foundational relationships of your life. Let's start with what an apology is actually supposed to do. At its core, an apology is a social repair mechanism. It signals that you recognize you have caused harm, that you take responsibility for it, and that you want to restore the relationship to good standing. This is a genuinely important function. Societies and relationships depend on the ability to repair ruptures, and apology is one of the primary tools for doing that repair. Used appropriately, it is not weakness. It is social intelligence. But chronic apologizing is not that. Chronic apologizing is what happens when the repair mechanism becomes decoupled from actual rupture. You are not apologizing because you caused harm. You are apologizing because some part of you has learned to treat your own presence, your own needs, your own existence in a space as inherently something that requires justification. Psychologist Karina Schumann has spent years studying the psychology of apology, and her research draws a distinction that is essential here: the difference between apologizing for something you did and apologizing for something you are. Most people intuitively understand the first kind. If you are late, if you forget something important, if you speak harshly in a moment of frustration, an apology addresses a specific, identifiable action. But chronic apologizers are frequently apologizing for the second kind of thing: for taking up space in a conversation, for having a need, for asking a question, for existing in a way that might, theoretically, cause the smallest possible inconvenience to someone else. This is not an apology for an action. It is something closer to a preemptive apology for being present at all. Where does that come from? To understand it, you have to go back to attachment theory, specifically to the work of psychologist Mary Ainsworth, who built on John Bowlby's foundational research to study how children develop different attachment styles depending on how consistently and sensitively their caregivers responded to their needs. Ainsworth's research, particularly her strange situation experiments in the 1970s, identified a pattern she called anxious attachment. Children who developed this pattern had typically experienced caregiving that was inconsistent, sometimes warm and responsive, sometimes distracted, dismissive, or reactive, in ways the child could not predict or control. What a child in that environment learns, at a level far below conscious reasoning, is that their needs are a variable in someone else's emotional equation, that expressing a need carries risk because the response to that need is unpredictable. And one of the most effective strategies a child can develop to manage that risk is preemptive appeasement. If you apologize before you are criticized, if you minimize your own needs before they can be dismissed, if you take responsibility for tension before anyone assigns it to you, you retain a measure of control over an environment that otherwise felt unpredictable. The apology becomes a shield, not because you did something wrong, but because preemptively claiming the wrongness feels safer than waiting to find out whether someone else will assign it to you. This pattern does not stay confined to childhood. It becomes, in psychological terms, an internal working model, a template for relationships that gets carried forward and applied, often unconsciously, to every subsequent relationship, including the ones where it no longer serves any protective function at all. You may now be in relationships with people who are warm, safe, and entirely unlikely to punish you for having needs. And still the old reflex fires. Because the reflex was never really about the person in front of you. It was about a nervous system that learned, early and thoroughly, that safety depends on minimizing your own footprint. There is another layer to this, one identified by psychologist Harriet Lerner in her research on women, anger, and relational patterns. Though her findings apply well beyond gender lines, Lerner observed that many chronic apologizers are using the word sorry not as a genuine expression of remorse, but as a kind of conversational lubricant, a way of softening any statement that might create even the smallest friction. Sorry, but I disagree. Sorry, can I ask something? Sorry, I just think. In these cases, the word sorry is not functioning grammatically as an apology at all. It is functioning as a hedge, a pre-apology for the crime of having a perspective. Lerner's research suggests that this pattern often develops in people who were implicitly or explicitly taught that directness, stating a need, a boundary, or a disagreement plainly, was dangerous or unwelcome. The apology becomes a way of asking permission to speak while appearing not to be asking permission at all. Here is what makes this pattern so difficult to unlearn. It often produces real short-term social rewards. People who apologize excessively are frequently perceived, at least initially, as easier to get along with, less confrontational, more agreeable. Psychologist Amy Cuddy's research on social perception found that people quickly categorize others along two primary dimensions: warmth and competence. Chronic apologizing reliably signals warmth. The problem is what it costs on the competence dimension and what it costs internally, over time, in the person doing it. Research by psychologist Robin Lakoff, who studied what she termed powerless language patterns, found that excessive hedging, apologizing, and qualifying tends to reduce how competent and authoritative a speaker is perceived to be, even when the content of what they say is identical to someone who states it plainly. This creates a genuinely painful bind for chronic apologizers. The apologizing was originally adopted as a strategy for safety and acceptance, but in professional and many social contexts, it produces the opposite of what it was designed to produce. It signals uncertainty about one's own legitimacy, which can invite exactly the kind of dismissal the original pattern was trying to avoid. And there is a cost that runs even deeper than social perception. Chronic apologizing rehearses, every single day, in dozens of small interactions, the belief that your presence is a burden requiring constant justification. Every unnecessary sorry is a tiny confirmation of a story that was never true to begin with. The story that you are, by default, in the wrong, and must actively work to offset that default. This is not a neutral habit of speech. It is a repeated act of self-diminishment, performed so often and so automatically that it stops registering as a belief at all. It simply feels like the truth. So what does change actually look like? Psychologist Schumann's research points towards something specific and useful: the practice of substituting gratitude for apology in situations where no actual harm has occurred. Instead of "sorry, I'm late," thank you for waiting. Instead of "sorry for asking so many questions," thank you for your patience with my questions. Instead of "sorry for venting," thank you for listening. This is not merely a semantic trick. It reframes the interaction. An apology positions you as having taken something from the other person that requires repayment. Gratitude positions the other person as having given you something: their patience, their time, their attention, which you are acknowledging rather than apologizing for extracting. The underlying interaction is often identical, but the story your nervous system tells about your role in it changes completely. This single substitution, practiced consistently, does something important over time. It begins to retrain the automatic association between your own needs and the assumption of wrongdoing. It will not happen quickly, and it will feel unnatural at first, often deeply unnatural, because you are working against a pattern that may have been reinforced for decades. But each instance where you replace an unnecessary apology with an accurate acknowledgement is a small piece of new evidence submitted to a nervous system that has been operating on old information for a very long time. There is one more distinction worth holding on to, because it matters enormously in daily life. The goal here is not to stop apologizing. Genuine apologies, offered when you have actually caused harm, are valuable and should not be suppressed. Removing your ability to apologize sincerely would simply replace one distortion with another. The goal is precision, to reserve the word sorry for the situations that actually call for it, and to notice with increasing clarity all the situations where you have been deploying it reflexively, as a shield, as a hedge, as a preemptive strike against a criticism that was never actually coming. You bump into a chair. The chair does not need your apology, and neither, most of the time, does the world around you. What you actually need is not to apologize less as an act of willpower. What you need is to slowly, patiently, correct the old belief that your presence in any given room is something that must be constantly justified. It never was. It never will be, and the sooner your nervous system receives that information clearly enough and consistently enough to actually believe it, the quieter that reflexive apology will become. Not because you are suppressing it, but because it will finally have nothing left to protect you from.